My name is Penny Sartori. My background is nursing. I was a nurse in the ICU for 17 years, other areas prior to working in ICU. And it was during my career as a nurse that I became interested in near-death experiences. So you can imagine nursing is a very evidence-based profession. So it was all very scientific. And my initial impressions of near death experiences that they were some sort of hallucination. But I think it was a night shift where I was looking after a man who was dying that really changed things for me. I can remember during this night shift, this man had a particularly unpleasant death. He was in a lot of pain. And during that night shift, I can remember adjusting the bed, and as the bed moved, this man was in so much agony, he nearly jumped out of bed. And I can remember our eyes connected, and I felt like I'd swapped places with him, and that I suddenly understood everything that he was going through. He couldn't talk because he was ventilated and he had a tracheostomy, but he was mouthing the words, "Leave me die, let me die, just let me die in peace." And that really was a big defining moment for me. So I settled the patient and made him as comfortable as I could. We called the doctor, we gave him increased pain-killing medication. But that was something that really, really made me think about what I was doing as a nurse, and it made me think about death. Now I can remember the following day, when after my night shift had ended, I couldn't sleep because this man was on my mind. So I called work and I asked how this man was doing mid-morning, and they said, oh, he'd actually died shortly after I'd left duty. So that was something that set me off sort of into a bit of a depression, I guess, and it made me start thinking about death and what is it all about. And so I started reading about death, and then I came across near-death experiences. And I thought, wow, these are really fascinating experiences, because the people who've had the experience say that death is nothing to be afraid of. And I became more and more curious about these experiences. And the more I read, the more I wanted to learn more about them. And so I realized, working in the ICU, I was working in the ideal place to do my own research into these experiences. So that's what I did. Together a research proposal, and got some ethical approval from that and all of the correct approvals, and then began my research. Now, that was over 20 years ago now. I studied near-death experiences during that time as part of a PhD, and I interviewed patients who had survived their admission to the intensive care unit. And this went on for 5 years, gathering the data. And then it took me about 3 years then to analyse it and to write it up. And doing that study has drastically changed my own life, but it's given me great insight into what people who have a near-death experience actually go through. So near-death experiences, with my research, I tried to see if they could be attributable to the medication that we give, because, of course, in ICU, we give a lot of strong pain-killing medication. Was it due to the medication that we gave? I tried to see if it was due to abnormal blood results. I tried to see if they were the same as hallucinations as well. When I compared cases of hallucinations to cases of near-death experiences, they were very, very different experiences. So with the near-death experience, the patient was very adamant that this was a real experience, and that if you hadn't experienced it for yourself, there's no way you could understand it. And they described it as being realer than real. And some of these patients actually had the out-of-body component as well. And when they were out of their body, one man in particular described events that did actually occur during the time when he was deeply unconscious. When I compared and contrasted these to the cases of hallucinations, what I found with the hallucinations is that the people who'd hallucinated, in retrospect, when I followed up and interviewed them, they could rationalise that they'd been hallucinating. And very often they were quite embarrassed by their behaviour, and they were like, oh gosh, I'm really embarrassed of what I was doing and saying. But the people who'd had the near-death experience were adamant that they'd experienced something that was real. Also, with the hallucinations, when I looked at them in depth, what they had described, it could be attributable to things that were going on in the background. So the background noise, the things that we were doing to the patients as nurses, the tactile stimulation, all of those sorts of things were what was contributing to the hallucination. Whereas people who'd had the near-death experience, it couldn't be attributable to those anything going on in the background. So there were clear distinctions there. With research in near-death experiences, if you consider how much research is done in all different fields, there's very little in the field of near-death experiences, although that is increasing now. But certainly at the time when I started my research, there were very few scientific studies done in the clinical area. So the research that I undertook, it was one of the first UK studies that was undertaken. So the pilot study began in 1997, so it was a long time ago. There was also Dr. Sampania, who you've probably heard of as well. And Dr. Sampania did a similar sort of study at a different hospital as well within the UK at the same time. So there's very little studies done, and I would really like to see a lot more. And again, Dr. Sampania is leading up the AWARE study as well, and that's a big global study which is currently still in the progress, I believe, of studying near-death experiences. When I first started my research, I think I was really quite naive because I thought I was going to come out of this at the end and have all the answers. But what I really found is that it raised far more questions than I answered. And there are so many different aspects of the near-death experience that I couldn't account for, because it's not just the experience itself that they have, it's all the changes that go with it. So a lot of people really are profoundly transformed. They have literally died to the person they were before the experience. So everything can change, their values can change, the way that they interact with other people, their jobs can change. They might have been high earners before and been in really well paid jobs and worked long hours, but all of a sudden, after their experience, things like that don't have any importance for them. And so it's not unusual for people to just resign from their jobs and maybe do voluntary work instead, or perhaps train to be a carer so that they could change careers. Sometimes their relationships then start to break down because their spouse or their loved ones no longer recognize them, and it's difficult for them to kind of get anyone to understand them. It's really hard. They've been through perhaps the most profound experience that they've ever had in their life. How people respond to them can really impact on how they understand it and how they integrate it into their life. Because a lot of people really find it difficult to integrate that experience because no one around them understands what they've been through. So many of the people I spoke to were really grateful when I was following them up and, interviewing them. They were really grateful to have that opportunity to be able to speak about their experience because not many people understood what they were going through. So you've got all of those different things. You've got the changes in value, the emotional changes that come with it. It's not unusual for people to become very emotional when they're recalling the experience. Many people I've sat with, they've been in floods of tears because they're simply recalling the experience. Now, that's not necessarily to say that they're upset as such. It just evokes a great deal of emotion for them. So, I've been with grown men who have really been in floods of tears because when they've thought back to that experience, they feel as if they're reliving it as well. There's one lady who I've been in contact with for quite some time. And when I meet up with her, she closes her eyes and she feels that she's back in that, having that experience again. And she's very often crying because it just brings back so much emotion for her. So you get those sorts of changes. You also get, those psychological changes where you're trying to fit into a life that you don't feel you fit into anymore. There can be a high divorce rate after a near-death experience as well. And not only are there physical changes and psychological changes, but there might also be other changes, such as changes in their electromagnetic field. So that was something I wasn't expecting to find, but it is quite common amongst near-death experiencers that their electromagnetic field can change as well, and that fascinates me. Some people find that they'll be wearing a wristwatch and it will stop working for them. Sometimes a really expensive watch, and I know a few people who've been back and forth to the jewellers taking their watch to be repaired, and the jeweller can find nothing wrong with them. And it'll work for other people, but it won't work for them. Similarly with electrical equipment as well, it can interfere. For some reason, their electromagnetic field can interfere with electrical items as well. So things like computers, they crash very frequently with some people who've had an experience. Something like a kettle or electric kettle or electric toaster, something like that may even blow up in someone's presence as well. Light bulbs will glow or flicker. So there seems to be some sort of change as well. Not with everyone who has the experience, but with quite a high percentage of people, there does seem to be those electromagnetic changes as well. So when you look at this and try to understand it, there's no one explanation that adequately explains all aspects of the near-death experience as well. So it's something that is currently beyond our comprehension. So I would really like to see more research being done so that we understand these more, because after a near-death experience, people really need a lot of support as well, and there's not a great deal of help out there and support. So thankfully, there's the International Association of Near-Death Studies. There are lots of support groups online there. So that is perhaps the biggest support out there. It is becoming more recognised by healthcare professionals, but certainly in the UK, there's not a lot of resources that you can direct people to for further support. So, finding therapists as well who are really understanding of the near-death experience, that is something is needed. There are some out there, thankfully, but few and far between, really. So that would be something I would like to see expanded upon as well, is more therapists to support someone who's coming to terms with understanding their experience as well. There is NDE UK, which is a very small organisation at the moment, but that was set up by a lady called Gigi Strahler, and after her near-death experience, it took her a good few years to process it and get to terms with it and understand it. So she has now set up NDE UK in the hope that it will help to support people understanding their experiences. When you come across people who've had a near-death experience, very often they're quite hesitant. They don't really want to talk about it. So the research that I did in the hospital, I didn't want to put ideas into anyone's mind at all. So I simply asked the question, while you were unconscious, did you have any memories? Now, a lot of people, most of the patients said, no, I can't remember anything. But there were a few who were like, oh, what do you mean by memories? And then they started to test the water with me. And I just said, I'm very interested in people's subjective experiences. If you've had any unusual experience, I'd be happy to listen to it. And once they knew that I was prepared to listen, they started to open up about it. So they'd say a little bit first, just to see what my reaction was going to be. And they'd start off saying, well, I don't know if it was a dream or not, but I can remember it felt like I was up there looking down, or I saw one of my dead relatives. And so I'd just say, okay, carry on. And then they would start to talk about their experience then. But that was the research I did in the hospital. So that was because I was, approaching the patients then. But at the same time as well, also people were getting to know about my research, and people started contacting me as well. So they contacted me at the university where I was studying, and then I put a website together. So they were contacting me there, and they were starting to share their experiences as well. And people were saying, I had this experience in childhood. I'm now my 70s or 80s, and this is the first time someone has actually acknowledged it to me that I did have some kind of experience. So, they're afraid to tell people in case people think that they're going crazy, or in case that they're going to think, they got mental health issues, when they haven't at all. They've had a very profound experience. But, one lady in particular who sticks out in my mind, she was in her 90s, and she said, I had this experience when I was a child, and I told my mother, and she gave me a row, and she forbid me from ever talking about it again. And so she'd lived with that all her life, knowing that something amazing had happened, trying her best to make sense of it, but she was never allowed to talk about it. So it's so important that there is support for people who have these experiences. And I think it's crucial that these experiences are in the education of all healthcare professionals, because if someone is in the hospital, they have an experience and they regain consciousness, it's important that healthcare professionals are able to recognise them at least, and then refer them on to further support. Because if people get a dismissive response, if they say to their healthcare provider, oh, I've had this experience, and the doctor or the nurse would say, oh, well, you've had a lot of drugs, that is such a dismissive response for them that very often those people will clam up and they will never talk about it again. They're never able to process that experience and make sense of it. So it's so important. And not only that, there are very pleasant experiences, but some near-death experiences can be frightening. Some of them can be absolutely terrifying for people. And there is very little support out there for people who've had the terrifying type of experiences. I've had people contact me through my website, and when they've had these hellish type of experiences or frightening experiences, started to see a pattern, and they'll start to say a little bit about the experience, but they can't sort of go into it and describe the experience because that recall of it is too frightening for them. So what I tend to see is people will email me first of all, and then I don't hear anything from them. Then they'll email me again in a few weeks' time. And sometimes they can almost be begging me to help them, saying, I need help, please. And they're pleading with me, but they're unable to express that experience either. So there is so little support. It's really important that we acknowledge the frightening experiences as well, and that we have appropriate therapists who can help them to understand and process that experience. Well, the thing is, sometimes if someone is skeptical, they're usually quite close-minded about it as well. So even if they really don't think there's anything in these experiences, the best thing that they can do is not just dismiss it. So I would really recommend that the most simple thing you can do for a patient is validate it for them. No matter what your opinion about the near-death experience, it's important that you acknowledge it, that other people have also had this experience, and that other people have reported it as well, and that there are support groups out there on the internet through the International Association of Near-Death Study, and refer them to the literature out there, or on the internet, or There have been scientific studies published as well. So Dr. Pim van Lommel in 2001 published in the Lancet Journal the study he did in the Netherlands. So, to look at the scientific research out there, and there's other scientific studies that have been published as well. So it's important that healthcare professionals are aware of those, but the most important thing for any healthcare professional is to validate it for that person and to keep their own feelings out of it. No matter if they think it's just some sort of hallucination, just acknowledge that other people have also experienced those experiences. I didn't come across any commonalities amongst the people who'd had the near-death experience in my study. There were approximately the same amount of males to females who had the experience. All of the patients were at a point where they were close to death, but it can affect anyone. They could be young, they could be old. It really does. It can affect every age, every kind of person across cultures. There are cultural differences, for example. So, in the West, very often people are more likely to see images of Jesus or Mary, for example, associated with their religions or the religious imagery around them, whereas perhaps in different cultures, such as India, they might be more likely to see Hindu gods or deities. They might see Yama or Yamadut, Yama the god of the dead, and Yamadut, the messengers of the god of the dead. So there's lots of cultural differences as well. For example, another one, in the West, we're more likely to see cases of a life review where people relive part of their life, usually in great detail. Some people relive all of their life, and they might only be unconscious for a very brief few seconds, but they feel like they very much live their life in a great deal of detail. Whereas in India, rather than have a life review, they tend to meet a man with a book, and a book of deeds. And in that book is all of the deeds of their life, and depending on how they've behaved in their life, whether or not they go to a different destination. So there's lots of cultural influences on near-death experiences as well. I think everyone is quite hesitant at first to discuss their near-death experience. I don't know, really, to be honest. That's the honest answer, because there are reports throughout the different cultures, but I don't know how forthcoming they are in different cultures with sharing their experiences. It might be really quite difficult to find cases. So it all depends on whether or not different cultures might feel less hesitant to report them publicly. I know a lot of people who have a near-death experience have absolutely no fear of death at all after it. Some people I've talked to have said, "Oh, I've died before. I know what it's like. I know what to expect. I am not afraid of dying." And it's something for me, before doing my research, I guess I did have a fear of death. But then when I started doing my research, I remember all of my friends and my family thought there was something wrong with me. They thought I was really morbid. And they were all saying, "Why are you studying death? It's such a morbid subject." But when I started to learn about death, that's when I really started to learn about life. And so being aware of that, studying this phenomenon, has really given me a completely different perspective on life and how I live my life as well. So for me, I'm not afraid of death. I am more accepting. I know I'm going to die at some point. I don't know when, and I don't know how. I guess I'm a little bit apprehensive about the mode in which I die, but death itself, I don't think is anything to fear when it's our time. So I think studying these experiences has just given me such a wonderful perspective of life and what a great gift life is. And so, the values that I had before I started my research have drastically changed as well. So, and that is quite really in comparison to what Professor Kenneth Ring found as well. Now, Professor Kenneth Ring did some of the best studies back in the early days of this research into near-death experiences. And I remember reading his work, and he taught a course at Connecticut University. What he found is that the students who was teaching about near-death experiences, at the end of the course, he found that they changed very much in the way that people change following a near-death experience. And certainly from my own personal perspective, that's the impact studying near-death experiences has had on my own life as well. So it's given me a completely different way of understanding life and how I live my life as well. So I used to be really quite competitive and quite money orientated, but all of a sudden those things sort of lost appeal to me. I was no longer competitive in the way that I was. Instead of having lots of money, it's more important to have quality time with my family. So all of those things, it made me reevaluate my life as well. So, people who have the near-death experience have so much wisdom as a result of what they've experienced, and it's something that we could all benefit from. We just have to hear their message. That's why I called my book The Wisdom of Near-Death Experiences, because I feel like I gained so much wisdom from these people who had had this experience. They've got a lot to offer the world. The message that people have after a near-death experience is a very simple message. It's treat it as you would wish to be treated yourself. And that's at the heart of all of the wisdom traditions, religions, all the same sort of thing. It's that. And if we all took that message on board, how different our world would be. So, we have so much to learn from these people who've had the experience. And so if you're curious about the near-death experience, anyone listening, I would recommend that you go and talk to someone who's comfortable sharing their experience with you. You can learn so much from these people. So, there's lots of different themes that arise during a near-death experience. Some people might have a lot of these components. Some people might just have one or two of them. So no near-death experience is the same. They're all unique. They might start off with an out-of-body experience. So the person might look down on the emergency situation from above. They might look at the medical personnel or people who are bystanders. They might find that they go through darkness, sometimes described as a tunnel, towards a bright light. The bright light at the end can be very, very bright. It's like the brightest light they've ever encountered, but it doesn't hurt their eyes. It can have like a magnetic quality where they feel drawn to go into that light. And once they get into the light, they often find themselves in beautiful gardens with lush green grass and vividly coloured flowers. They might come across a border or a barrier or a doorway, some sort of something that they know they can't go beyond. And they know that if they cross that river or the doorway or barrier, that they won't come back to life. Some people have a life review where they relive the whole of their life in a matter of seconds. And some people meet deceased relatives or friends. Sometimes they don't know that those relatives or friends are dead at the time of their experience. Sometimes they're sent back to life, or they're told that it's not their time, that they have to return. Sometimes they meet religious figures or a presence or a being of light. And very often people feel this overwhelming sense of love. It's the most beautiful, deepest form of love that they've ever experienced. They can't really put it into words sometimes because it's beyond any human experience that they can recall. And, it has such a profound impact on them as well. But some people have like a dark void experience. They might find themselves, they feel like their body doesn't exist, and they might just be existing in a dark void as well. And, the distressing types then, sometimes they can be the traditional type of near-death experience, but interpreted in a frightening way. Or it can also be very distressing, very traumatic for them, and they might feel that they're they're going into hell or looking into hell. So there's lots of different types of the experience, and some people might have a mixture as well. That's interesting. So some people feel that they are given that the choice to return. Now some people don't even remember making that choice. They just remember waking up in the bed. Some people feel like they were so enveloped in that love that where they were, they wanted to stay. And I've had a lot of people talk to me about the guilt that they've experienced as a result of their return to life, because they were prepared to stay where they were, yet they had young children and family, and they felt really guilty that they were prepared to leave their family and young children because of that experience that they were having. So sometimes, it takes a while to process that guilt that they feel as a result of wanting to stay where they were. Some people, I can remember some of them in the hospital study that I did, some people were sent back by the people that they encountered as if they were quite angry. One lady encountered her mother who was dead, and her mother was really angry with her, and she was pointing her finger saying, "What are you doing here? You shouldn't be here. Get back there." And she said, "I didn't know what I was doing there." I said to my mum, I don't know. I don't know how I got here." And their mother was angry and saying, "Get back there. You go back to those children." And there was another man as well, and he said, "I found myself, and there I was in this dark place, in this tunnel, and in that tunnel, all the people I used to work with when I was a miner, they were there because he worked as a coal miner. And he said they were in that tunnel with me, and they were all really angry with me and said I shouldn't be there. They were all shouting at me, and he said, I said to them, I don't know how I got here." And all of a sudden he said he was back in his body. So, yeah, returning to life, that can be different for everyone. So some people just don't remember making that conscious choice. Some people did. But, part of it is that some people do feel a lot of guilt as well. So that's important for people to acknowledge as well. I think one of the most important things is to educate people that near-death experiences are a valid phenomenon. So we don't understand them yet, but they are something that people or patients, when they're hospitalized or when they've encountered near-death circumstances, some people might have these really deep subjective experiences, and it's really important that all healthcare workers are educated that they need to validate these experiences. So it's important that they don't dismiss them. I work in the university and teach student nurses and try to reiterate the importance of how they respond to people who've had a near-death experience. And I try to, bring it into the teachings that we do as well, just to make people aware of these experiences, because, how we respond as healthcare workers can really impact on if that person processes the experience. If they don't process it, they might need to be going back and forth for more therapy. So if it's addressed as it happens, that can lead to them having a fulfilled life and understand the experience as well. And I think as people are dying, they can be quite fearful. I remember before I'd started my research, my grandfather had a brain tumour and he was dying. And I can remember we nursed him at home, and he used to point at the doorway and say, "Look who's there." And he was adamant that deceased members of his family were there. And my grandmother used to get quite frightened by that, and she used to run out of the room. Now, I hadn't got into my research at that point, so I just assumed it was a hallucination and I ignored it. But he was clearly communicating with the people before he died, and I've seen that time and again now in my job as a nurse, but also through my study I've spoken to so many people who have had those encounters as well. And I think certainly from my perspective, doing my research as well has helped members of my family who've been dying as well. So again, with my other grandfather, he was dying, and then that was just as I was coming to the end of completing my PhD, and I can remember having long chats about death with him. He had prostate cancer, and over the months that he was dying, we just had really good conversations about death, and he would never have spoken about that before. We were able to talk about it, and I was able to say what these people had experienced. And, we nursed him at home, and he had a peaceful death as well. And I think he probably made peace with his death beforehand. And again, with my grandmother, when she was fully aware of my near-death experience research, and we spoke about it as well. And, we had those good conversations. So I think at the end, although initially she was quite frightened, she had a good death. She was nursed at home as well. We had lots of carers coming in to help out, and she was surrounded by her family, and she had a good death as well, as did my other grandmother as well. So I've had that privilege of being at the bedside of family members who were dying, but I've also seen the impact on knowledge about near-death experiences can ease that transition into death as well. So I would really recommend people become familiar with these experiences, because it can give you all different insights into death and dying. And it can also give comfort as well to people, to the loved ones left behind. And they're very useful for people who are grieving, is to read about these experiences, because they've been shown to be quite helpful as well. I think the thing that really makes me most curious about the research I did was that I didn't get the answers to my questions. I couldn't say that a certain drug caused the experience. I couldn't say that it was just a hallucination. It was far more than a hallucination. And, when I was analysing my research, I couldn't attribute it to just one drug. I couldn't attribute it to being hallucinations. And the thing that really struck me was that patients were describing to me a very hyper-real state, a heightened state of consciousness, which was occurring when their brains were severely physiologically insulted and they were unconscious. Yet subjectively, they were having this really heightened state of reality to them. So that's something I can't understand, how they could have that experience when their brain was so severely physiologically insulted. So there's a lot more that we don't understand about the experiences, and I think, we certainly need more research in this field. And that was the conclusion of my PhD thesis, was that we're all going to die at some point, and we don't know what happens after we die, because these experiences occur leading up to the point that we die. After, we won't really understand what it's like to die until we experience it in its entirety at our own death. So we'll never really have the answers until the very end.